Grace, her resilience tested like never before, arrived at the courthouse with an aura of guarded determination. The burden of the past week, the accumulation of revelations, the mounting pressure, the very act of keeping family and hope affixed like pieces of a stained glass window, ached in her bones. Her poise, however, remained unshaken as she navigated through a sea of bodies and flashbulbs, the cacophony a mere backdrop to the still, small voice that whispered within her, justice was on the horizon. In the dim light of his cell, Oliver's reflection danced on the dull surface of a tin cup, a fractured version of himself trapped in the steel and concrete of Lockhaven. The adrenaline of the previous days had ebbed, leaving in its wake a pensive, introspective man who pondered over each twist and turn in his unexpected narrative. The possibility of his freedom seemed real and yet numinous, flickering like a mirage on the distant path of his imprisonment. Within the courtroom walls, the atmosphere crackled with tense expectation. A certain electricity permeated each glance and each shuffle as the defense prepared to present what had been conjectured for days, a series of insights that could dismantle the prosecution's case entirely. Tom Harrison, with meticulously gathered evidence, had become the fulcrum upon which the possibility of Oliver's freedom now teetered. As he took the stand, he bore not only the facts unearthed by his relentless pursuit but also the convictions of every hidden truth awaiting exposure under his carefully laid argumentation. Fred Turner, drawn to the courthouse like a shadow gravitating to the light, watched and signed and mostly unnoticed from the back of the room. The narrative's potential twist gripped him with anticipation and dread, an unspoken realization that Oliver's exoneration might birth his damnation. The trial, a microcosm of the national judicial landscape, saw local sentiments flowing like tributaries into the river of national outrage at systemic failure and miscarriage of justice. Oliver found communion and hope, a coupling that strengthened his convictions, lifting his gaze towards the far-off promise of exoneration and recompense. In the hush of deliberation, as the jury weighed the scales of justice, Crestwood itself waited, suspended in a fragile hope tinged with fear. The reflections of a fractured man in a tin cup, of a town questioning its core, and of a justice system under assessment, hinged on the awaiting verdict. The eighth day saw the courtroom awash with a tense anticipation. The browns of the furniture seemed darker, the sunshine filtering through the solemn windows bleaching the colors from the room, the air within heavy with a silent weight of dread and hope in equal measures. Crestwood was a town on the edge, a collective heartbeat pulsing at a rhythmic weight. Tom Harrison, a detective turned reluctant warrior, was at the front line of a battle that felt both personal and poignant. In the hushed silence, as the jury focused their gaze upon him, he presented the tardy fruits of his investigations, evidence that pointed towards Fred Turner's potential involvement. Murmurs ran like ripples through the courtroom as Harrison elucidated his findings. A pair of gloves, photographed in Fred's possession but found in Oliver's shed. A highly contentious document that indicated Fred masterminded a profitable business deal using a wrongfully incarcerated Oliver as a scapegoat. Mystery surrounded these late entries, raising questions around their validity and their implications. Among the people wrestling with this escalated confusion was Grace. Crumbling under the shock of the revelations, she found herself wondering how blind she had been to Fred's supposed duplicity. It felt like stumbling over unseen stones on a well-tread path, unexpected and painfully startling. Fred Turner sat, his facade of approachable ease eroding under the unsettling glare of suspicion. As Harrison meticulously unfolded tales of deceit and gluttony, he felt his past catching up, the mounting dread knotting in the pit of his stomach. It was the same all-consuming fear he'd seen in Oliver's eyes, the same damning clarity reflected in the gaze of every Crestwood resident that day. In his sterile, prison confines, Oliver felt a relentless weight lift off his shoulders. Like distant echoes reverberating through the somber walls of Lockhaven, news of the trial's shift reached him. A surge of hope colored his dreary reality, washing over him in purifying waves of relief. A storm was brewing, its impending arrival felt through the tangible undercurrents in the courtroom. The revelations had landed like cannonballs, blasting gaping holes through the prosecution's case. And amidst the debris of perplexed faces and murmurs, hope resurfaced. A once distant possibility gained a palpable form as the devastation gave way to new anticipations. Grace found herself buoyed by this reborn hope. The sleepless nights and tumbled thoughts now seemed worth the emotional turmoil. Distressed whispers echoed around her, but all she could focus on was the wave of optimism triggered by the unprecedented turn of events. Despite the inherent uncertainty, her chest thrummed with rallying excitement. Justice was no longer a mirage. Meanwhile, within the confines of Lockhaven, a mirrored reaction unfolded. The strictly regimented prison life shattered in the face of Oliver's potential freedom. Lunch tables bustled with speculations, workouts echoed with tidbits of trial rumors, the unremarkable routine of Lockhaven spattered with unexpected color. For once, Hope was a celebrated guest within the dreary gray walls, its presence accepted with open arms. Marcus stood quietly observing the subtle transformations, his heart buoyed by the vim in everyone's faces. He found himself drawn towards this collective optimistic energy, his instincts whispering a pleasant assurance. Oliver, his cellmate and friend, was on his path to a rightful freedom. However, at the receiving end of these optimistic tides was Fred Turner, drowning in the relentless waves of damning accusations. A cold fear ran its icy fingers down his spine, his mind a whirlpool of disbelief and dread. The shadow of uncertainty stretched ominously over his well-crafted life, darkening the edges of his trust-built relations. As revelations tumbled out in the steely silence of the courtroom, Fred Turner found himself in a vertiginous spiral of accusations and disbelief. Once an onlooker to Oliver's trial, Fred had become the central figure in a narrative quickly slipping from his grappling fingers. His formerly mundane life, speckled with community picnics and casual weekends, was now scrutinized under the sprawling magnifying glass of Crestwood speculation. His latent resentment for Oliver, an inanimate appendage since their bitter fallout, was suddenly cast in the chilling light of probable motive. Familiar faces around the town eyed him with hidden unease while sympathetic nods gave way to silent avoidance. Fred, suddenly robbed off his social camouflage, felt vulnerable and cornered in his very own hometown. Life seemed to mimic a predatory game where he had unwillingly been tagged as the prey. The media, a non-entity in his life just a week ago, now trailed him with relentless focus. Every footstep, every conversation, every involuntary reaction turned into sensational news. Amidst the mounting accusations, Fred found himself retreating into a shell. The world outside blurred into long and foreboding shadows while he grappled with the rapidly spiraling realities. Dread carved deep hollows into his once burly figure, his affable charm was replaced with icy aloofness, and his contagious laughter was now a forgotten melody replaced by silence, the transformation seemingly overnight and yet painstakingly long. Tension wove itself into the fabric of Crestwood as deliberation day approached within the confines of the courthouse. Conversations flickered with speculative whispers, the air thrummed with anticipation, and eyes lingered on the solitary structure, the symbolic amphitheater to Crestwood's most riveting drama. At the eye of the storm stood Grace Kane, her world spinning faster than ever. Time was no longer a gradual ticking, but a series of heartbeats amplified by uncertainty. As the courtroom chambers closed off to the jury's deliberation, she found herself grappling with impatience and dread, both clamoring for attention in her already muddled thoughts. Meanwhile, the shifting narrative found resonance within the walls of Lockhaven. The prison had unwittingly become a parallel universe reflecting Crestwood's energy, the trial serving as a shared beacon of interest. Among its residents, Oliver's newfound prospect of freedom elicited a universal anxiety. Anxious eyes studied Oliver, seeking reassurance from the man who had unknowingly come to symbolize their collective hope. Throughout these escalating uncertainties, Fred Turner grappled with a daunting reality. His days, once filled with familial warmth and professional satisfaction, now stuttered past in stifled moments, each saturated with a sense of impending doom. He oscillated between defiance and acceptance, disbelief and angst while watching his life become a crucible for public scrutiny. The sun had barely broken the horizon, but Crestwood Courthouse was already a hive of constrained excitement. The smattering of reporters, the whispered huddles of townspeople, they all conveyed a sense of expectation. And in the sea of whispering voices and clicking cameras, Grace Kane stood statue-like, a monolith of muted strength amidst the tumult. She felt the courthouse door heavy against her hand as she entered, the gravity of the trial's outcome pulling at her like a relentless tide. Her pulse kept time with her footsteps, each beat a resounding march that echoed within the chambers of her heart. Oliver's fate, the restoration of her family's broken narrative, hinged on the impending words of a few. Inside, the judge's robes rustled like fallen leaves as he took his seat, declaring the court in session with practiced gravity. The somber crackle of his voice sliced through the electric atmosphere, commanding stillness in the room as he read from the case file. "We are gathered," he began, "to bear witness to the verdict in the case of the people versus Oliver Kane." The jurors filed in, a parade of solemnity that held the room breathless. Oliver, standing tall yet indisputably vulnerable, bore the scrutiny with a stoic front, his eyes fixed on the panel that held his future in their collective conscience. Grace's hand found the wooden bench's edge, anchoring herself to the physical world even as her spirit soared and plummeted with each breath she drew. The juror who took the stand carried not just a slip of paper but the weight of a man's life. In the matter of Oliver Kane, the foreman's voice quivered. Betraying emotions kept at bay, the jury finds the defendant not guilty. The words tumbled out, unruly and vivacious, sparking a chain reaction that spread like wildfire through the room. An audible gasp rippled through the throng, a thunderous release of suppressed breaths. Not guilty. The phrase clanged around in Grace's head, a relentless drum that defied all comprehension in its immensity. Outside, Crestwood absorbed the news with an exhalation of relief. It wasn't just a declaration of one man's innocence, it was an emancipation proclamation for the town's stained reputation. Lives could be rebuilt, laws reconsidered, and trust restored on this astonishing day. Back within the cold, sterile barriers of Lockhaven Penitentiary, the news of Oliver's vindication ushered in an uproar of clearing clouds. The inmates, who had turned into a bastion of reluctant allies, celebrated the triumph, a signal flare that, in their grim world, justice could very well find a way. But even as jubilation spread through the cells and corridors of the prison, a shadow fell upon Marcus. A friend rejoiced in Oliver's liberation, but he also felt a private grieving over the shattering of his rhythm, a rhythm set to the unyielding bars and concrete. The finality of the verdict echoed in him an end and a beginning. Oliver's freedom was also his loss. As the fervent hubbub of Oliver's acquittal settled, a new focal point emerged in Crestwood's ever-evolving saga. With eyes no longer fixed on Oliver, the attention turned toward Fred Turner, the man now encased within the same judicial grasp that had once tightened around Oliver's life. Fred, who had lived his life in a reactive state, never proactive, always the bystander, found himself center stage in a theater of distrust. The walkway to the courthouse felt unending, every step an eternity as a cacophony of questions from journalists bombarded him, a stark contrast to his once unnoticed existence. Within the confines of the courtroom, anticipation curdled into anxiety. The spectators, a sea of grim faces, watched as the prosecution spun a tale not so dissimilar from the one that had entangled Oliver. Fred found the air stifling, the judge's gavel a harbinger of palpable doom. The trial proceeded in a whirlwind of testimonies, each word hammering a nail into Fred's coffin. Evidence after evidence stacked up against him, a transaction here, a twisted motive there. The shadows of Fred's own doubts and guilts began wrapping around his throat, suffocating him with the realization that, unlike Oliver, his narrative might not gain a triumphant finale. Back at the Kane residence, a bittersweet pall had descended. The taste of newfound freedom was tempered by the gnawing guilt of another's fateful descent. Grace found herself torn between the elation of Oliver's return and the panged conscience for Fred's impending doom. Thoughts of Fred filled her mind, an unwelcome visitor casting a long shadow on their newly resurrected harmony. At Lockhaven, the news of Fred's incarceration was met with pin-drop silence. The prisoners watched solemnly as Marcus, their once voice of quiet stoicism, bowed his head in remembrance of a freedom that once seemed possible. Oliver's absence was palpable, an aching void where hope had briefly flourished. As the final verdict was handed down, life imprisonment without parole, the corridors and cells of Lockhaven seemed to echo with the shockwaves. For as one man had exited the grim fate, another had been ushered in, a cruel turn of the carousel that distanced them from freedom's embrace. Oliver, still far from the harrowing reality of the barbed wires, unknowingly became an emblem of the injustice that Lockhaven held within its walls. Crestwood simmered with the unease of a tale that, although unfolded publicly, held many a secret fold. The tremors of Fred's sentence had barely resonated beyond the courtroom when an inexplicable tragedy struck. In the pre-dawn hours at Lockhaven Penitentiary, a silent killer wove its way through the bars and into the cells. Unseen, unfelt, it left in its wake a macabre stillness, life extinguished unnoticed. The first guard arrived to the usual reluctance of mourning, expecting the slow stir of inmates and the cacophony of life behind bars. Instead, he encountered an eerie quiet, a final quiet. Row upon row, the inmates laid motionless, the tumult of their lives abruptly hushed in permanent repose. Marcus, the linchpin of so many narratives within those walls, had succumbed with the rest, face etched in an everlasting expression of peace that life in Lockhaven never afforded him. This wave of death, indiscriminate and ruthless, reached from the lowest echelons of the incarcerated to the wardens themselves, leaving behind a haunting question: how? As the devastating news escaped the confines of Lockhaven's grim walls and swept over Crestwood, the dawning horror cast a pall deeper than any shadow of doubt before. The implications were immediate and chilling. gripping the heart of Crestwood in an icy fist of fear and disbelief. The Kanes, still constrained within their fragile bubble of reclaimed normalcy, felt the sharp sting of the news acutely. Oliver stood aghast, a man uncertain of his footing in a world that remained persistently cruel. Grace, her features as white as the pages that bore the headlines, grappled silently with the implications. Once, she had fought against Lockhaven's walls, now she mourned the silence within them. A hidden terror pulsed beneath the shock, a truth so outlandish, so monstrous, that denial was the immediate and only refuge. A poison had slithered through the prison, bringing death like a shadow through the night. Olive, though now free, felt an inexplicable link to the tragedy, an arcane thread weaving through his subconscious, knitting pieces of an unfathomable horror he dared not recognize. Crestwood, nestled in its innocent ignorance, believed the tragedy to be an unfortunate incident, a fluke in the grand tapestry of life. Yet, a small part of Grace's intuition churned with a dreadful suspicion. Did Lockhaven's dark specter silently stalk the streets of their beloved town? In the wake of an inexplicable massacre, would peace ever really be possible? Oliver's days post-release teetered on the edge between liberation and a haunting disquiet. With the Lockhaven tragedy casting long shadows, his freedom felt marred, an abstract painting splashed with somber strokes on an otherwise vibrant canvas. Though Crestwood tried to embody normalcy, the uncertainty brought by the inexplicable deaths at the prison gnawed at its collective consciousness. For Oliver, the town's embrace was a paradox, a blend of genuine warmth and latent suspicion. The watchful eyes of those who once deemed him a pariah now spoke volumes of their concealed wariness. In the Kane household, the rhythm of life was stuttered by a new, unsettling cadence. Grace could sense the minute shifts in Oliver's behavior, fleeting glances that seemed to pierce through the veil of reality, small lapses in conversation, a certain distance as if his thoughts lingered elsewhere. With gentle probing and tender watchfulness, she tried to bridge the unspoken chasm between them. Lucy, like her mother, reached out to her father with both her heart and her confusion. Their shared memories, a currency of their former life, seemed both a comfort and a reminder of a gap that had yet to be bridged. Oliver, for his part, grappled with the fragmented mirror of his life, attempting to piece together the reflection that gazed back at him, a reflection that seemed increasingly unfamiliar. As days rolled into weeks, a series of peculiar notes began to emerge. Written with a hand unrecognizable as his own, yet indisputably addressed to him, Oliver discovered messages apparently penned by this mysterious James, the other who shared his existence, yet remained an enigma even to Oliver. Each note, crisper than the last, spun a web of allusions and confessions that detailed an audacious admission of responsibility for the tragedies at both the school and Lockhaven. Oliver's mind reeled as he traced the unmistakable connection between the elusive James and himself, a bitter unraveling of identity that chipped away at the edges of his reality. The crisp air of autumn found Grace Kane standing amidst a kaleidoscope of falling leaves in Crestwood's Central Park, searching for solace in urban nature's transient beauty. The past weeks had filled the Kane home with a disconcerting mixture of hushed conversations and silent meals, as the once reassuring presence of her husband became a source of concern and invisible strife.